Just by way of introduction, just to say that the preparation of an inventory of historic gardens in Ireland has long been an objective. It's been talked about for a very long time, but for various reasons, the project was given to people, and for various reasons, they never undertook it. And I look after the National Inventory of Architectural Heritage, and I was approached by my director and said, "You seem to have a method to gather information relatively quickly and to get it published. Would you take on an inventory of gardens as well?" And gardens are not my speciality, but I am interested, so I took it on. So what I'm going to try and describe is very simply how we did the inventory and some of the issues that we encountered. Maybe firstly to say that in terms of what we have included, the inventory is primarily of what we call domains, which are the lands associated with country houses, the lands for the enjoyment specifically of the country house itself. However, we also have included, because of the wider definition, public parks, a limited number of public parks, primarily in Dublin City, a small number of designed graveyards, and a bigger number of suburban villas. Suburban villas in a different sense from the Italian sense, villas which are essentially in the suburbs of Dublin City, Cork City and Limerick City, primarily built in the late 18th, but mainly in the 19th century. So, but in the overall scheme, most of the sites that we've recorded are domain landscapes. The first point really to make in terms of Irish gardens and design landscapes there has always been a political problem in terms of Irish estates. And that's essentially arises from the fact that there was a major transfer of land in the 17th century, following the wars of the 17th century, and a complete, essentially, recolonization of the country in the 17th century. And that has always led to tensions in terms of the relationship to people to the historic estates. This is a very interesting project. Oh, no, sorry. The first thing to say is that has also led to major mapping projects. So right back to the 17th century, when the land was being redivided or reallocated in the 17th century, there were major projects of mapping and census making. And this is a very interesting project, which has just recently been published by Trinity College on a website, where the 17th century mapping is now has tied into the census, where you can find exactly the transfer of land from one former owner to the new owners. So in this case, there was an Irish, now it's not specifically from Irish to English, because there were Old English as well in Ireland going back to the 12th century. But in this particular case that I'm showing in the slide, it was of an Irish owner, and then completely the land being transferred to new English owners who happen to be Protestant. And you can see there they've identified the profitable land is 297 acres, and the full 297 acres are transferred to new owners. And that tension, I think, is captured in this image, which is a 19th century slide of, on the one hand, the landless, dispossessed peasant looking up at what we call sometimes the big house. And what's interesting also in relation to this image is how trees are depicted. So in relation to the big house, trees, there's an alley of trees. relation to the peasant cabin, there's a stump of a bush or something. So there has always been this tension in relation to the historic estate and its future. And I'll come back to some of that at the very end. Okay, in terms of the criteria that we set ourselves, they're really the standard criteria for the identification and and definition of the sites to be included in such an inventory. And I think maybe the only thing that we have added in is in relation to the criteria of containing notable plant collections. We have what's known as the Tree Register of Ireland, and we've included that. In other words, specimen trees on the Tree Register is also regarded as part of the plant collection. How did we do it? And to be honest, initially we kind of said, right, what do? We don't actually have the money to do a field project. How are we going to do it? And we went out to tender, and we had a team actually that came to us from Wales with a proposal to say to us that there is all the Irish historic mapping of the 19th and early 20th century, the full set of those maps are all kept in the British Museum Library in London. And unlike the libraries in Ireland, where the same maps are, but where there's a huge demand on those maps, nobody is looking at Irish mapping in Britain, strangely enough. And there is a very important set of maps, which is the first edition 6-inch maps and 1-inch maps, which date to around the 1830s. And on those maps, the domains are hatched in a slightly with a tone over them. So when you look at the map sheet, you immediately see a domain landscape. Why it was done like that, I don't really know, but it doesn't mean that they're very clearly identified as different from the rest of the landscape. And essentially the project was, we had a researcher sitting in the British Museum Library, literally going through each one of the map sheets, and at the end of that had made up a list of about 6,000 sites. Depending on how you counted them, we had 5,999 or 6,001. And what that discrepancy was, I've never been able to establish, but around 6,000 sites. And I said, well, that's very interesting. We now have 6,000 sites that we've identified that was on the first edition Ordnance Survey maps. How many of those survive today? And how do we make some sort of an assessment of survival? And we in the office had full access to the Ordnance Survey aerial photography. And what we did was we made a comparison between the first edition Ordnance Survey map and the level of survival on the 2000 aerial photography. And all of this has been published on our website. And what I'm now going to do is maybe go through and show you a number of the sites that we've recorded to give you an idea of how the landscape has changed and what sites have survived and what have not. We made a very definite, clear decision that anything that was shown on the first edition map we would publish, even if it's very clear that the site is now completely destroyed. But before I show you the examples, in the overall, about 6,000 sites have been identified. We have made a provisional, and I really highlight that, assessment of survival. We have a database and paper archive which is stored in the National Botanic Gardens, and we have a system to add new sites. Giving you an idea of the density of sites around the country, these are all the numbers are map sheet numbers, so forget about the numbers. But the highest density of sites are the areas around Dublin City. I'll mark it here. So Dublin City, which is here, Cork City, which is here, sorry, and Limerick City. And what they are those suburban villas that I mentioned to you previously. And then after that, the next highest density of sites is in the better off lands. Not surprisingly, that's where the better off agricultural land in the Midlands and all this area here. And the further west you go, the lower density of sites. And it's generally the area with the poorest land, and that most of the people who were displaced from their lands in the 17th century were all moved to the lands in the west. Okay, so this is just one site we recorded, and this is how it's shown on the first edition Ordnance Survey map. We have no documentary evidence as to what it was like or what its significance was, and all we can say is that this was a site that's shown as a domain on the first edition Ordnance Survey map. That's what's there now. An industrial estate. This is where Viagra is made, and it's one of the biggest industrial estates in the country. What's curious in relation to this is the continuity of boundaries. So even in a modern 20th century industrial estate, some of the historic boundaries of the fields of the 18th and 19th century domain are still reflected in the modern development. This is the site, not very far from Dublin, of an important 17th century house, which is now a ruin. And in particular, just note the two lakes and the wall garden here. And that's what survives today. The house itself as a ruin in the middle of the landscape. The wall garden still survives on the landscape, and the two lakes are now marked by clumps of trees. But the boundary of the lake is exactly the boundary as it's shown on the first edition Ordnance Survey map. This is a particularly important 17th century and one of the very rare 17th century formal landscapes to survive in the country. So a particularly important site. And it still survives, but you can now see the beginning of the pressure of urban development. It's about 10 kilometres from the city centre in Dublin, and this is all new suburban housing coming up, a new golf club here. The vista is still perfect and perfectly preserved, but you can see the dangers and the weaknesses of and the threats that exist for this particular site. This was a particularly extraordinary site that nobody knew about. What's curious in relation to this is that this is a site where right in the centre there's a medieval tower house, a particular building type which I think doesn't necessarily exist everywhere else in Europe, but it's a medieval tower house, and the tower house had been written about in all the academic publication, and nobody had ever highlighted the fact that there is this octagon, perfect octagon, and it's completely geometrically correct with the tower house right at the geometric centre of the octagon. Whole separate talk in relation to that, but this is what survives today. And what's incredible is that it's now a working farm. The centre garden area is completely gone, but everything else survives perfectly intact. All the clumps of trees, most of which are archaeological sites and identified as archaeological sites, but still survive perfectly intact. And this was one of our big discoveries in the sense that nobody had really talked about it previously. But at the end, or following on the Great Famine in the mid-19th century, right up to independence in the early 20th century, many of the big houses were destroyed, some for political purposes, some were burnt consciously, and some were abandoned by their owners and unroofed because primarily the estates depended on rent and subletting of land to right down to the small peasantry. And when the land was then broken up and the big estates were broken up and given back to small farmers, the economic basis for many of these estates collapsed. And so the country is also a country of many ruins of big country houses like this. And maybe this cartoon captures that thing. This is a cartoon from the 1930s where you have the remnants of the big house here and the subdivision of the land between the new small farmers. And curiously enough, maybe reflecting the attitude that we have to trees, or the attitude that was in existence at the time, that the historic trees have all been cut down and still exist as stumps in the landscape. I just want to finish on this slide, and maybe the point I'm trying to make in this slide, well, firstly, is to say that the survey is fully published and fully accessible on our website there. But there's maybe a couple of points I'd make here. One is the whole issue of just publish what you have. And what we have found very interesting since we've published is the amount of material that has come back to us from former owners. So this particular estate, Kilmacurra, is now part of the National Botanic Gardens. It's an estate not very far from Dublin City, but it's used as an overflow from the National Botanic Gardens. And essentially the estate was in very poor condition, and the Botanic Gardens had the objective of doing a restoration project. And one day, completely by chance, I got an email from Australia from the former family that formerly owned the estate, to say that they had drawings of all the flower beds and planting of the garden, and would we be interested in getting a copy? And this was an incredible find. But we've had similar experiences of many people coming back to us with images of the estate. So we have this experience of publishing stuff, and then in turn many people coming to us and saying we have material. The big question though for us is how accurate are those assessments that we've made using the first edition map and the 2000 area photography. And on a trial basis, essentially I didn't have the budget to do much more, but on a trial basis we decided to pick two counties, one which is very much under the influence of urban development from Dublin City. You know, it's on the fringes of Dublin City, and the other a county right up in the far northwest corner, which is very far from the pressures of urban development. And there we did, not a very detailed, but we did do an on-the-ground field survey, which has also been added to the website. And what we found there is that by and large, the very broad definitions that we give in relation to survival have proven to be more or less correct. There have been a few that we've had to change, but in general, the definitions have been quite accurate. And the final point is just, I mean, because the question does come up in relation to protection of these landscapes. We don't have a formal system of protection for the landscape in Ireland. However, the project, and essentially the project is there for information, but many local authorities have taken our material and have identified our county as one which is particularly rich in these design landscapes. And we have a general objective in our development plan that these should be a material consideration in terms of planning. So it gives them some level of protection without it being fully a protected landscape. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.